Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca with Waffle Flower Crafts. Today's video is another episode of One Stamp, Three Ways. In today's video, we're going to use the Grateful stamp set, and we're going to use it in 3 different ways, 3 different techniques, and 3 different sentiments. So let's get started creating these 3 cards. I have the Grateful stamp set out, and this is illustrated by Flora Waycott, and I love all the little kitchen items from pot holders to cutting board to pitcher that you can put some flowers inside. I have some watercolor paper, and I'm going to flip it over so that the smooth side is facing me, and I'm going to treat that with anti-static powder tool because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. So I have my first stamp, which is the cutting board, on an acrylic block, and I'm going to ink that up with Versamark ink, which is that embossing ink that's nice and sticky that my embossing powder will stick to. And I'm just going to stamp this out. Now there's lots of details in this stamp, and I want to make sure that everything comes out crystal clear. That's why I'm really putting pressure all over the stamp. And now I have my second stamp ready to go. My first thought was to stamp these out on a 6x4 piece of cardstock and then just color them right here on the cardstock. I decided to color them after I die cut them with the matching dies. So you'll see that I end up coloring 3 different stamps there instead of just the 2 that I have here in the image. And I've covered those with a bunch of white embossing powder, and I'm using really nice fine detail embossing powder because I really want all of those lines to be crystal clear in all the little details on the stamps. And you can even see those in the video there as I move that card panel around. You can see all the little details in the embossing powder. Next, I'm going to use my heat tool, and I have it nice and hot, and I'm going to melt that embossing powder. Now I have my Distress Oxide sprays in a couple of colors, and I'm just unscrewing the top and taking that little spray nozzle out so that I can dip my paintbrush right inside there and then paint that embossed, stamped, and die cut image from the Grateful stamp set. So once I do that, I can just set it aside to dry. You can see that I'm working on the Waffle Flower water media mat, which is a great surface to do any kind of water-based medium or painting. And I absolutely love how these colors turn out as paints. I think it's so much fun. It's a lot easier to paint with them, or they have a much brighter, bolder color effect when you paint with the Distress Oxide sprays rather than if you ink up a mat or something and then spray it with water, which I really, really like. Like, look at those colors, they're gorgeous. The second way that I'm going to use this stamp set is to stamp it with VersaFine Black Onyx ink on top of cardstock. When I'm stamping on colorful cardstock, I like to use this VersaFine ink because it is a pigment ink, and so it sits on top of the cardstock and it doesn't get muddied by the colors of the cardstock. So I'm going to choose 3 different shapes from the Grateful stamp set and stamp each one out on a different color of cardstock. And you can see again that I'm just putting some real good pressure on that stamp to make sure all those fine details really show up really, really well. You could use a stamp positioner for that, but I find no problems doing it with an acrylic block as long as you put a little pressure in there. The next way to use this stamp set is to use colorful inks. So in the first example, we're using the embossing ink and heat embossing. The second example, we're using black ink on colored cardstock. For this example, we're using colorful dye inks. And I have 4 different colors from the Waffle Flower dye inks. And I'm going to use one of the stamps from the stamp set to stamp it multiple times to create a pretty colorful background. The biggest tip with creating backgrounds like this is to not overthink it. I do try and not put the same color next to each other, and I try to tilt the image in different directions to give it a more organic feel. Okay, now it's time to put these cards together and add some sentiments. So for this first card, I'm going to use the Grateful for You stamp sentiment from the Grateful stamp set. And I'm using some Versamark ink, so you can see that I coated my cardstock with anti-static powder tool first, and now I'm getting my sentiment stamp nice and inked up. And I'm just using an acrylic block to kind of center it at the top of a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of gray cardstock. I'm going to pour some white embossing powder on top, and I definitely like to use the fine detailed white embossing powder to make sure that all of the sentiment is clear once I add the powder to it. Now I'm going to use my heat tool, get it nice and hot, and then melt that embossing powder. Next, I am going to take some tape runner and adhere my gray panel onto a side folding 4¼ by 5½ inch piece of white cardstock note card. And then I'm going to add a couple of those stamped and die cut images on the different colors of cardstock. The two on the side I use tape runner, and the one in the middle I'm going to pop up with some foam adhesive to add some really fun dimension to this card. And that was super, super easy to put together, and I love the look of those different colored pot holders and the cutting board. So for this next card, I am going to use a sentiment from the Be Her Sentiment stamp set. This time I am going to stamp that sentiment with the VersaFine Black Onyx ink. I do like stamping my sentiments with this ink because it's really nice and crisp. I'm going to lay the sentiment down where I want it on the card and then pick it up with my acrylic block just to make sure that the stamp is nice and straight on the block itself. And this time I'm going to stamp it again at the top, but kind of off to the right hand side there. And that's going to give me room to place that cutting board on the left hand side. So since these are 4 different colors, I'm kind of arranging them in a Roy G. Biv format, which is really pleasing to the eye because it makes sense as far as the colors and where they fall on the card. So I'm going to put the left hand side image down and then the right hand side image down, and then I'm going to layer the other two in the middle and try and decide if I want to use tape runner or pop it up on dimensional adhesive. For the green pot holder, I am just going to use tape runner and put it down kind of in the middle but off slightly set to the right hand side, and then the picture will go in between the pink cutting board and the green pot holder, and this one will get popped up. I do like mixing and matching whether the images are flat or dimensional. And again, super, super easy, but I love the look of that one. For this last card, I'm going to use the sentiment from the Big Bold Sentiments stamp set. I'm going to use the matching die as well to cut it out. Again, I have some cardstock treated with anti-static powder tool, and I'm going to stamp this large greeting sentiment stamp with Versamark ink. And once I stamp that down, it'll stay nice and sticky so that I can pour the white embossing powder on top. And this is a large area that I'm covering, so I'm just going to make sure that I really get embossing powder over all of those letters so that the image of it is nice and clear when I heat set it. So again, get my heat tool nice and hot. You can see that I can work on the water media mat here because it is heat resistant. So once that's done, I'm just going to cut it with the matching die. Then I'm going to layer our stamped panel on top of some gray cardstock. I did cut our stamped panel down to about 4 by 5¼ use some tape runner to adhere that to a 4¼ by 5½ inch piece of gray cardstock, and then pop up that die cut sentiment with some foam adhesive. I am going to use a couple of pieces because this is a large die cut and I want to make sure that it stays popped up even through the mail. So I don't want the top or the bottom to get crinkled or to bend down, and that's why I'm using 3 pieces of foam rather than just the 1 strip. And I decided for this one, I'm just going to place it right in the middle. This way you can still see most of the pattern and all of the colors of the pot holders that I stamped for the background. So that's it. We have 3 different ways to use this stamp set from the Grateful stamp set, whether you're heat embossing and watercoloring or stamping in dye inks or stamping in black ink on cardstock, and then 3 different sentiments to use as well. Let's continue this conversation down below in the comments. Let me know if you have some other ideas on how to use this fun stamp set with different techniques or different sentiments. Thank you so much for stopping by today. See you soon.